my video again because I forgot I have to say some things. So hello everyone and welcome to the virtual TRA Marketplace. We're so excited to have you with us today and every day as we go through. This is day 4 now of 6 days of the conference, and this is our 4th keynote speaker, and one that I personally have been very excited for because those of us in TRA that are political wonks really love Ross Ramsey. His ability to break down what's going on politically is second to none, and so we're excited to have him. I did want to remind you guys about a couple things. He will take your questions and wants to take a lot of them. So be sure to ask them in the Q&A window down below or in the chat window, which is just to the left or right, depending on where you're sitting. We are also broadcasting this on Facebook, so I'll be looking there to see if there's any questions coming in that way, and I'll be reading those off later or pushing them to Kelsey so she can read them to you. Otherwise, we do have a sponsor for this session as well. And so if you bear with me with just 1 second, we're going to play a quick video from our sponsor, Texas Mutual. Really appreciate their participation and their sponsorship of TRA for a very long time. Definitely check them out, txmutual.com. 1 second.
In response to the pandemic, Texas Mutual will distribute $330 million in dividends to eligible policyholders 2 months ahead of schedule. We're also sending $2 million to nonprofits on the front lines of the COVID-19 effort. Better days are coming, but in the meantime, we'll be on the job helping Texas businesses. To learn how dividends are supporting employers in this time of need, go to texasmutual.com/dividends.
Thanks again to our sponsor, Texas Mutual. And now I'm going to turn it over to our president and CEO, Dr. Emily Williams-Knight. Emily?
Great, thank you. Thanks everyone. Ross and I had a chance with the group to actually connect a little bit before the session. And what I'll share with you is that it was just a couple of weeks before the COVID crisis hit the US that we actually were fortunate to have Ross speak to our board. And we were talking about the speaker's race. We were talking about, didn't even, I think, talk about the election as much as sort of what was going to happen in Texas politics. And 6 months later, here we are, and I can guarantee you we're going to have a very different update because everything seems to have changed. So much of our world in the restaurant industry, but also the political landscape and some of the things that COVID has brought, as well as other social movements. So I just want to say on our behalf, we have had a great relationship with the Tribune for a very long time. I think the way that reporting has come, especially with our industry, has been very fair and very balanced, and we're really grateful for that partnership. And Ross, clearly as busy as you are, your insights are so valuable. So I know you're going to address the group first, and I'll have Kelsey do an intro of you because I think it's quite important. You have such a fascinating background. And then as Anna said, we really want to get to questions because at our board meeting, some of the most insightful, people were able to ask some really hard-hitting questions, which I know Ross is not afraid to answer. So thank you so much from all of us and all the restaurant operators across Texas for being here. We're very interested in what's going to happen, especially legislatively and politically in the coming months. And I'll have Kelsey do a formal introduction, but thanks again.
Thank you.
Of course.
All right, so Ross Ramsey is executive editor and co-founder of the Texas Tribune, which is the only member-supported, digital-first, nonpartisan media organization that informs Texans and engages with them about public policy, politics, government, and statewide issues. He writes regular columns on politics, government, and public policy. Before joining the Trib, he was editor and co-owner of Texas Weekly. He did a 28-month stint in government with the Texas Comptroller of Public Accounts. Before that, he reported for the Houston Chronicle, the Dallas Times-Herald, as a Dallas-based freelancer for regional and national magazines and newspapers, and for radio stations in Denton and Dallas. So without further ado, we'll kick it off here and turn things over to Ross. And as Anna said, everyone, please send questions in the chat and Q&A. I'll be monitoring those with her, and we'll come back once Ross has shared some of his wisdom and insight and get to those questions.
Thanks for the introduction. I really appreciate it. Sometimes I worry that I'm going to be repeating myself, especially when I'm back talking to a group that, as Emily said, I talked to back in February. None of the 3 biggest stories that we're talking about now were even going on then. We didn't have a pandemic. We were not in a recession. We were not in a new civil rights movement, and we weren't this close to an election. So there's kind of 3 big issues and a 4th one that has crept up on us. So I want to kind of walk into this that way. We'll start with the election because a lot of the things right now are framed by that election. We've had a really rough last few months. You guys have been on the leading edge of the rough part of the last few months. It's been a very strange time. I didn't actually know what Zoom was on March 1st. So, and now I live here in this little box. So I'm sure you guys all have your own little versions of that. The election this year is really interesting. You know, if it was just a conventional election, we didn't have any of the other three things, we would be looking at this question that keeps percolating in Texas about whether this is a red state or a blue state, politically speaking. And it's been a red state for a long, long time. The last Democratic candidate for president who won in Texas was Jimmy Carter in 1976. The last set of Democrats who won statewide elections in Texas for state offices was in 1994. Lloyd Bentsen, who became the U.S. Treasury Secretary in 1993, was the last Texas Democrat elected to the United States Senate. It's a red state. It's been a red state for a long, long time. And the legislature and the executive branch and the judicial branch have all been red since 2003. So as we've gone through the years, the Democrats have made inroads here and there. They've been losing a lot of elections. But in 2018 in particular, they roared back a little bit. It's ordinary in a president's midterm election for the other party to gain seats. Barack Obama had a really rough time in 2010. You may remember the Tea Party election. The Republican Party surged all over the country. The same thing happened to Donald Trump. You know, in his first midterm, the 2018 elections brought a lot of people into office who, you know, frankly, didn't expect to get into office. The Democrats won 2 seats away from the Republicans in the congressional delegation. They won a net 2 seats away from the Republicans in the Texas Senate. And they won enough seats in the Texas House to make the Texas House effectively a bipartisan organization after years of, you know, pretty strong Republican control. We come into this session, or this election rather, with the Democrats very, very hopeful about maybe making some more inroads, and the Republicans in a somewhat defensive position. If you believe that the Democrats won seats in 2018 that they probably shouldn't have won, that it was just a kind of a fluky year, there's a couple of those that the Republicans think they can win back. But the Democrats look at the map and they see 83 Republicans in the 150-member House, 67 Democrats, and they say, you know, if we win 9 more seats, we have a majority for the first time since the 2001 legislative session. And they're making a real play for that. As we go into this election, it kind of depends on what happens at the top of the ticket, but it also happens what's happening with money. So the top of the ticket argument is that if you have a president or a governor or whoever's at the top of a ticket in a given year in your party, and that person does well, then you'll probably do well also. It's certainly been true in Texas for a long time because we were a state that allowed straight party voting. So I could walk in and pull a lever for the Republicans or pull a lever for the Democrats, and not only vote for the candidate at the top of the ticket, but vote all the way down the ticket. We got rid of that, and this is going to be our first big election without straight ticket voting in it. And, you know, people like me have the question, we know a lot of people are going to show up to vote for Joe Biden or for Donald Trump and to, you know, take part in that race. How many of them leave before they get to the next race, John Cornyn versus MJ Hager? And what about the race after that and after that? And it's going to be interesting to watch that fall off in the tickets and then the fall off in the voting, and to see whether what happens at the top of the ballot influences what happens at the bottom of the ballot. In the 2016 election, one of the assistant clerks or, you know, administrative staff at the Harris County clerk's office, you know, where they count the votes, put a picture of herself up on Twitter, and she was holding a piece of paper up like this, and it was that continuous paper that comes out of, you know, old computer printers. And she said, this is the Harris County ballot printed out. And they pulled back to a broader picture where you could see her feet, and it went all the way to the ground and curled up. It was 11 pages long. If you have a straight ticket vote, you can vote in the top line and take care of all 11 pages. I think in this election, you know, the test is going to be whether the heavy smokers make it all the way to the bottom. And if you're running for JP, or you're running for constable, or even if you're running for a local judgeship or a sheriff's race, there's going to be a question about how many voters get to that part of the ticket, how influenced were they by what happened at the very top of the ticket to Trump and Biden. The other way to look at this is to say, you know, this could be a bottom-up race, or this could be a race that's driven less by what happens at the statewide ticket level and more by what happens in congressional and legislative races. If you think about sitting in a political war room and you're looking at the United States of America and you're trying to figure out where you want to deploy your resources, your people, your money, all of that kind of stuff in a national election, Texas is a really hard part of the map to play with. I can compete, roughly speaking, I can compete for about the same amount of money in New Mexico, Oklahoma, Arkansas, and Louisiana, the states that border us. I can play in all 4 of those for about the same price it would take to compete in Texas. So if I had 5 Senate races and I could win 4 of them for the same money that I could win 1 of them for, I would ignore Texas. Texas is going to be on the back burner when it comes to distributing resources for presidential races and national issues like that. If Joe Biden starts spending money in Texas, that will be a sign that he thinks, or his campaign thinks, that they've got the rest of the country locked up and they just want to run up the score. Same thing's true of Donald Trump. If they feel like they're going to lose Texas, they've got bigger problems elsewhere and they're going to spend money in those smaller states. So really the resources that come into Texas are going to be concentrated on congressional seats and on legislative seats, because those are smaller districts. I don't have to compete for the whole state with all 20 plus media markets. I can compete in this little piece of El Paso or that little piece of Dallas or this little piece of Houston, whatever it is. So far, one measure of this so far is that in 2016, the Republican candidates for Congress in Texas, if you took all of their mid-year, this time of year campaign finance reports and added them all up, they were $20.7 million ahead of the Democrats. The Republicans running for Congress had raised that much more than the Democrats. This year, that's flipped. The Democrats have raised $7.5 million more than the Republicans have. You could see this float up to the top. Instead of a top-down race, you could see Democrats and Republicans who are turned out for big local races, like their member of Congress or their member of the Texas House or Texas Senate, could have more influence on the presidential race. You know, I'm here to vote for Chip Roy or Wendy Davis, so while I'm here, I'll vote for Joe Biden or Donald Trump. You may have more of that kind of an effect. And you're already seeing that among the donors and the parties. So a lot of the organizing is taking place down there in the middle of the ballot. The Texas House Democrats, as I said, are trying to get 9 more seats so that they can get a majority. And they might be able to do that and they might not. If you were betting on this, you know, on one hand, you might say they're trying to do 9 seats better than they did in their best year in 2 decades, 2018. On the other hand, it looks like a Democratic year, at least at this point. It'll change a couple of times, but at least at this point, it looks like a pretty good year for Democrats. And they have 12 to 12.5 seats where they think if the conditions are right, they're going to contend this year. So, you know, I think a lot of the legislative races are going to be very interesting. So on November 4th or 5th, when we've finished counting votes, if they come in that quickly, if you ask me, is the state blue or red, I'm going to be more inclined to look at the results on the middle of the ballot, congressional races, legislative races, sheriff's races, that kind of thing, than at the top of the ballot. That said, I think the presidential race is going to be close. All of the polling, including the polling that the Tribune does with the University of Texas, has been pretty tight in that race. Trump has been ahead, usually outside of the margin of error, which means it's a pretty good assumption that he's 1 or 2 points ahead. But in a state this red, a Republican incumbent president ought to be further ahead. And I think a lot of the reason that he's not is the obvious one. He's a disruptive personality. And, you know, the people that really like him really, really like him. You know, when we look at our polls and say, what do you think of the job Donald Trump is doing? Republicans are right there with him. They're really tight with him. And one way that manifests itself is if you watch down ballot people, members of Congress, members of the Senate, who are Republicans, and if the president has said something controversial on Twitter and you go up to those guys and you stick a microphone in their face and you say, what do you think about that? They won't say anything bad about the president. And mostly that's because they don't want to offend their voters, and their voters are very strongly with Donald Trump. So with his own group, Donald Trump is very strong. But the reaction on the other side is very, very negative. The Democrats are just as against him as the Republicans are. And the small group in the middle, and there is a small group in the middle, the independents, are leaning more toward the Democrats right now in the polling than to the Republicans. And that's why we've seen the numbers, which used to be in the 10 to 12 point range of an advantage for Republicans, being down closer to the margin of error. So something to watch as we go forward. Geographically in Texas, you know what a map looks like the day after an election? It looks like a big Texas-shaped bowl of tomato soup with some blueberries in it, where Dallas and Houston and Austin and San Antonio are. But the people are in those blueberries. And so the question is, you know, how many votes do you stack up in the cities, and how many votes do they stack up in the country, and where does that meet? So the place to watch geographically is the suburbs. A lot of the suburbs have been reliably red for years. This is the places like Collin County, Denton County, Tarrant County, although Fort Worth's not really a suburb for political purposes. It looks like that on the map. Williamson County, Fort Bend County, Montgomery County, those used to be Republican jewels in the crown. And, if you came out even in the city to country vote and you won those suburbs, you could control the state. Those suburbs are getting purple. They're not really blue yet for the most part, although Fort Bend is threatening to be blue. But they're a lot less red than they used to be, and that's where the Republican margin is going. So I would watch the suburbs. A lot of the political pundits are particularly watching suburban women. And that's I think, you're going to see a lot of advertising that's aimed at folks like that, both on the top level presidential race and in those middle races. If you look at where those congressional races are that are being contested, there are 7 of them. They're in those suburban areas. A lot of the races that are being contested in the Texas House, where the Democrats are looking to win a majority and the Republicans are trying to hold the line, are in the suburbs. So as a matter of taking the state apart and saying, okay, just pay attention to the part of this that's in motion, watch those suburban areas around the big cities. The issues have changed completely since I talked to your board back in February. These issues didn't even exist. We have a pandemic now. We have a recession caused by that pandemic. And we have a civil rights movement that started with or really was sparked by the killing of George Floyd. And all 3 of these things are very influential, I think, in this election season. We kind of had the coronavirus recede in, the headlines. We were talking about this before we started this morning. The coronavirus has receded in the headlines a little bit as the Democrats started their convention, as Joe Biden named Kamala Harris to the 2nd spot on his ticket. That's kind of been in the headlines a lot. I think it's going to come roaring back. And I think the next way we're going to be talking about the coronavirus is probably going to be schools and football. These are the 2 big giant lab experiments that we have going on right now, or field experiments, if you want to think of it that way. There's been a lot of speculation inside the media, outside the media, among the medical community, certainly in politics, about what happens if you put 5.5 million Texas kids back in public schools. Not all of them are going back. Everybody has the option of staying at home and studying virtually. But after a certain period, all of the schools have to provide in-person schooling for anybody who wants it. So we've got this experiment going. If you send them in and it goes really well, that's going to be good for the incumbents and the people who said, let's go ahead and open the schools. If it goes badly, it's going to go the other way. But we will know when we start voting in mid-October, when early voting starts, we will know how that experiment has gone. And that'll be a pretty good proxy for how we're dealing with the coronavirus at that point. The other one is a little frivolous, but it's also something that's kind of central to Texas cultural life, and that's football. If you put all these kids back on the field or back in the locker room before the field in training, all of those things, whether you're talking about high school or college or even the pros, how the football season goes is going to be another thing that we all have on our minds as we go to vote starting in October. We have 2 examples right now, and they've got kind of opposite results. The NBA opened in kind of a bubble season, where they're all kind of locked in a facility somewhere in the Lost Acres of Disney World in Florida, and they're playing basketball, and they've been playing, and it's really competitive, and nobody's allowed to go out, and they haven't had a bad experience with the coronavirus. It's actually gone pretty well. One of my favorite things, if you're a sports fan, is that their shooting percentages have gone up because they don't have time to fool around. So they're all business, so they can hit free throws now. So kind of interesting. NBA's gone pretty well. Major League Baseball, on the other hand, allows players to come and go. They haven't been in a bubble. They still travel to each other's stadiums. There's no version of Disney World for them. And they've had very mixed experiences. Some of them have had really lousy experiences. Since I was a little kid, I've been a St. Louis Cardinals fan. And 17 of the St. Louis Cardinals can't play right now. They've got coronavirus all the way through their system, where the rest of the league has played 25 games. They've only played 10 or 12. So, you know, if football goes that way, and that's what we're thinking about, or that's one of the things that we're looking at when we go back to vote, that's how coronavirus, I think, will show its face in this election. The recession is sort of an interesting and mixed bag. The sales tax, according to Comptroller Glenn Hager, hasn't gone down nearly as much as people thought it would. It turns out that we've all turned to a lot of online purchasing, and sales taxes for the month of July, sales tax returns for the month of July were actually higher this year than they were last year. So some of what was expected there hasn't turned out. On the other hand, a lot of taxes have gone down. We had an oil crunch that we would all be paying attention to back in March. We'd all be paying attention to that if we hadn't had a coronavirus and a recession, but it's feeding this. Oil and gas taxes are down, severance taxes are down. The end result, at least for now, it's probably not an end result, but you know, the reading right now is that the legislature will come back to a budget shortfall of about $4.5 billion for the current budget. And they probably got enough money in their rainy day fund, which is kind of a savings account, to cover that shortfall. But they'll immediately turn around and write a new budget for the 2 years that follow. And the numbers don't look so great for that. As you go into this recession and as we settle into this recession, you know what your businesses are like. A lot of storefronts are closed right now. And it's going to be a hard time for business. And when business has a hard time, taxes go down. It's going to be a hard time for government. So one of the things that the legislature is going to have to cope with and deal with is a shrinking budget, or at least a flat one, while their expenses are expanding. So a lot to look forward to for legislators there. The civil rights and police debate has taken a new turn just in the last 48 hours certainly, but in the last week or so. This started with the killing of George Floyd. There were calls for police reforms, for new scrutiny on how police conduct their business, whether they're using the right kinds of weapons, whether they're using the right kinds of procedures, whether all of the things that police do or are assigned to do really belong in a police department or in some other area of government. And one way this has manifested itself is with calls from some of the most liberal Democrats to defund the police. And one of the places where they've sort of taken a stab at that is the city of Austin, where I live, where the city council decided to take $150 million currently in the police public safety budget and cut $150 million from it, but mostly by moving it to other areas. So it looks like they cut it by a third. That's not exactly what they did, but that's how it was sold. They did cut some funding there. They moved some things out of the police budget, like park police. They made they stirred up a big pot, and the response from the state's top three leaders, Governor Abbott, Lieutenant Governor Patrick, and Speaker Bonin, was to go to Fort Worth yesterday and say, we are going to propose and back legislation in January that any city that cuts its police force or defunds its police or cuts its police budget is going to have its property taxes frozen at the current level. There are a couple of legal problems with that, but you can see that the political boundary lines have been set where they're trying to create a situation where you're either for the police or against them, and try to turn the argument away from the civil rights argument that frankly the Republicans weren't doing well in. These are the kinds of issues that you're going to see, and the kinds of ways of fighting about those issues that you're going to see as we go into the election. And I don't think it's a mistake that it's happening right now at what I consider sort of the traditional starting line for a November general election. We talk about these things from the primary elections on, but it's really when you get in the last couple of months when the campaigns put their money on the ground, put their forces on the ground, start their get out the vote campaigns, all of that kind of stuff. It's about right now, and you'll start to see issues frame up as the Republicans say it this way, the Democrats say it that way, and the civil debate, we hope it's a civil debate, ensues from there. When all this is over in November, we're going to have a legislative session that comes in January. It's going to happen very quickly. And the first problem to solve is that we don't have a Speaker of the Texas House. Dennis Bonnen isn't running for re-election after some problems he had last summer. He was a one-term Speaker. That term ends in January. And the first business of the people who get elected to the House in November is going to be to choose a replacement. They're kind of not talking about it right now. It's really a weird situation. And the reason for that is because the Democrats don't want to talk about which Republicans they like best at a time when the Democrats think they might win a majority in the House. And the Republicans don't want to talk about which Democrat they might like best, because that would amount to admitting that they might lose control of the House. So part of the argument, part of the conversation is frozen until we get past November 3rd and we know whether it's a Republican House or a Democratic House. I think you can safely say this. I think the composition of the House is going to be close enough, whichever party is in the majority, that the next Speaker will have to have a dozen or a dozen and a half votes from members of the legislature from the other party. If it's a Republican House, a Republican Speaker is going to need 12 or 18 Democrats' support to become Speaker. The Democratic House, same thing, 12 or 18 Republicans to become Speaker. And I think the House is going to proceed like a body that, you know, whoever's in the driver's seat, they're going to be looking closely at the rearview mirror all the time and making sure the other party is okay, because I think it'll be such a narrow majority that they'll have to pay attention to the opposition. They're working now on how to meet. Under current House and Senate rules in Texas, they can't meet telephonically. They can't meet the way we're talking and deliberate and vote. They have to do that in person. So there's a chance that they go in and the first thing they do is they elect a Speaker and then they approve a rule change that lets them meet on Zoom or on WebEx or whichever of these forums you like best or they like best. In the meantime, they have on the House side put up plexiglass shields in a couple of I think it's 3 of the really large committee rooms that separate one member from another. And it's the same kind of plexiglass that you have as a sneeze guard over a salad bar in a restaurant, which, you know, might be a good idea if you're sitting next to somebody from the other party anyway. But they're setting this up. They're trying to figure out how to get the members of the legislature in and out of the building safely, how to get their staff in and out of the building safely. And since this is a place where we basically go to fight, where you hear public hearings and you let people voice their opinions and debates, how to get the public in and out of there. You know, if they want to talk about, you know, any of these other issues, any of the legislation that's up about school funding, about all of the things that you holler at legislators about, how are they going to pull this off? And they're still working on that. They're still not sure exactly how that's going to go, but they're trying to get it all lined up by January. So right after the election, we're going to have another set of problems to solve. As I said, they're going to have to decide how to meet during a pandemic. They're going to choose a Speaker. They're going to come back and look at a budget that starts $4.5 billion underwater, and then another budget behind that that looks like the shortfall might be even bigger. And they'll be talking about a couple of things when they look at that budget. There'll be another conversation about Medicaid expansion. If you followed that argument, Texas is one of several states that has not joined what was originally part of Obamacare to expand Medicaid. And it's a matching program where the state spends 10 or 20 cents for every dollar it gets back. Texas hasn't done that, but it's a big source of money. They may be short of money. There's been some talk on the fringes about, well, maybe we should legalize pot and tax that. You're going to hear all kinds of stuff like that when you get into this legislative session. It's going to be a redistricting session, either in the regular session or in the special sessions that follow, which is always a huge distraction to legislators and the kind of thing that, you know, if you're trying to get a word in edgewise on issues that are important to you, you kind of have to sort through all of their political arguments to do so. I think we're going to have some fallout. I'm a little reluctant to predict what it might be, but I think we're going to have some conversations about what to do during a pandemic. We're going to have some legislative pushback, both from Democrats and from some of the Republican Party, about the governor's orders during the pandemic and whether he overstepped his bounds, whether he should have called the legislature back. This police and this argument about, police powers, what the police do, how they conduct themselves, how they're funded, how we handle the fallout and response from the George Floyd killing and the civil rights movement that sparked. I think all of those things could combine to make our next session, from my standpoint, as newsworthy as the last half of a year has been. The big variable here that kind of overhangs everything in Texas and in the United States right now is, how long does this pandemic continue? And at what point do we find our version of normal, whether that involves waiting for a vaccine, not waiting for a vaccine? How do we, how does my favorite restaurant operate? Can I ever go to a movie again? Can I please have a martini? We're still figuring that out. And as we go through this election, choosing our representatives, and then they go into session figuring out how to represent us, I think the questions in our minds right now are going to be the questions on their minds as we go forward. That's a pretty, quick rundown of the election and the session before us, and happy to answer any questions.
Well, now my green screen is really just a green screen, so that's interesting. You never know what you're going to get on live Zoom and TV Meet. Oh, there we go. Yay, back at TRA Marketplace. All right, thanks for that, Ross. That was a great rundown of so many different issues that Texas is facing right now and that our members are facing. I'll kick things off with a few questions, and everyone watching, please submit your questions as well. Now's the time. Strike while the iron's hot. So Ross, a couple things. You talked about the speaker's race, and of course, a lot of unknowns there with, how the politics will come down after November. But for those of us who are interested in this sort of thing, what should we be watching for? Who should we be watching on both sides to kind of get a feel for where the winds may be blowing?
I think the dodgy answer I'll give you first is that you really don't know until you see what the composition of the House is. Mm-hmm. Until I know what the electorate looks like, it's hard to pick out who's going to get elected. The people who are maneuvering for this, though, are, you start with the list of people who 2 years ago were maneuvering to replace Joe Straus. The winner of that contest was Dennis Bonnen, but there were a lot of members of the House, most of whom are still in the House or will still be in the House after this election, and some of them still want to be Speaker. Nobody's really raised their hand, and by raising their hand, I mean nobody's filed to run for Speaker. You're not allowed to legally campaign for Speaker until you file papers with the Ethics Commission. Nobody's done that yet. But I would expect some of the same cast of characters. It includes, people like Drew Darby and Travis Clardy and, on and on and on. For Price. I think there were a dozen or so last time, all of them Republicans. And then you open the can and say, well, which Democrats are interested in this? And I think one of the most interesting things about how this Speaker's race is going to proceed, it's easy and also incorrect to look at a legislative body and look at the party that's in power always looks like it's fractious and the lieutenants are all fighting each other. And right now that's the Republicans in Texas. And they look like there's 4 or 5 different kinds of Republicans in the Texas House. And the minority party always looks unified because, they're fighting off the majority all the time. So they're standing shoulder to shoulder. But there are just as many fractious elements in the Texas Democratic Party contingent in the Texas House as there are in the Republican Party. And if they're the majority, I think one of the most interesting exercises is to pluck out 4 or 5 or 6 of the Democrats who've been big players in the past. People like Symphonia Thompson and Yvonne Davis and Rafael Anchia and Trey Martinez Fisher. And I'm going to leave off somebody's favorite and they're going to yell at me. But, there's a bunch of them.
Yeah.
You send 5 or 6 people into a room and say, okay, you guys go in there and figure out which one of you is going to be the candidate and come out. And I think they're going to be in that room for a long, long time. Mm-hmm. And I think this sorting out is going to be, really, really interesting. It's going to be informed also, one last thing, by what they feel like the voters said. In the 2018 elections, the legislature and, you know, everybody else came out of those elections thinking that the big message from voters was pay attention to public schools, pay attention to property taxes, pay attention to the state's share of the cost of public education going up and the local share going down. And that's what the last session was about. They got their information from the voters, so will the people voting for speaker.
Makes sense. What about the dynamic between the future big three? We're likely to have, you know, like you said, a pretty, I don't know that conflicted is the right word, but a pretty balanced House in terms of Democrats and Republicans. So
Right.
one would think that would moderate the House potentially. Then you're likely to still have Governor Patrick leading the Senate with a pretty conservative bent there. And then of course you have Governor Abbott, who, as you mentioned, has really led through this whole crisis without a lot of legislative kind of activity from at least what we can see from the outside. So what's that dynamic likely to be like as we enter what promises to be a very unique and difficult session?
Yeah, I think, you know, the dynamic, you know, sort of overall is kind of like it was when Joe Strauss was Speaker of the House. Strauss had a moderate House, Patrick had a conservative Senate, and Governor Abbott was honestly and frankly more attentive to the conservative part of the Republican Party in terms of, you know, who he was catering to than not. And, you know, the best example of that dynamic, if you remember the bathroom bill,
Yes.
was a case where, TRA was right in the middle of all of that. But, you know, you may remember that, you know, a lot of businesses were telling, a lot of Republicans in business were telling Republicans in government, don't do this.
Right.
It's, you know, contrary to what our customers want. But the politics of the thing, you know, the most conservative Republicans were adamant for that piece of legislation, and the top leadership got stuck. That's a more classically partisan issue than something like the coronavirus. So if you go into this next session and they're talking about the coronavirus, I think one of the things that has really stumped the governor to a great extent and stumped some others to some extent is how much of this is not really a straight up Republican or Democratic problem. You know, a great example of this is we started off saying, yes, we will social distance. And yeah, it's a good idea probably to close everything for a minute, and we don't need to wear masks, and be sure to wipe down everything you touch. And now we're more of in a mode where, you know, it's still probably important to wipe things down, but less important than wearing a mask. Some things can be open, other things can't be open. And if I'm the governor and I'm trying to sort through all of that and keep the economy going, I don't have a straight up answer that satisfies all the Republicans and is also safe, or that satisfies all the Democrats and is also safe. And I think if you go into a legislative session with that kind of a mix, you take a little bit of the partisan edge off of things. But maybe I'm just naive and hopeful.
Well, and then on the flip side of that, we have redistricting, which will surely put the partisan edge right back in. So I was in the legislature for many years, and I just can't even imagine how you do redistricting in this environment, right? For those who don't know, there were a whole slate of hearings planned for around the state, you know, in pretty much every pocket of the state all year, so that we could, you know, hear public input and presumably draw maps. And here's where I'll sound a little naive, presumably draw maps, right, that represent the people and what they wanted. And then COVID hit and all that went out the window. We have probably delayed census information coming in, which Texas is always on such a short turnaround for getting census data and then turning around maps because of the way our legislative calendar works. So how the heck does the legislature do this in COVID, I guess, is really my question.
You know, the big question about the redistricting right now is, when is the census going to deliver its count? If the census arrives late, it triggers a bunch of legislative machinery that, you know, frankly gives the legislature more time to draw maps. If the census reports come in late, too late to handle in the regular session, the legislature will be back in special session sometime around now, this time next year, to draw those maps in a special session that's presumably only about redistricting. And that could have the, somewhat beneficial effect of separating the redistricting fight from the other legislative business of solving the budget, talking about police, all of the other things that I mentioned a few minutes ago. If the census comes back on time, then the legislature is on a deadline. And if they don't complete legislative maps by the end of a session in which the Census Bureau has delivered a full census, a lot of lawyer work there, then the drawing of the maps goes out of the legislature's hands and into the hands of a 5-member legislative redistricting board, 4 members of which are already elected Republican statewide officials, and 1 member of which is the speaker who will be elected at the beginning of the session. So if the census delivers on time, the maps will ultimately be decided by Republicans, the legislative maps, because the Republicans and the Democrats in the legislature presumably will lock up. All the governor has to do is veto it, kick it to the panel. If, on the other hand, as is expected right now, the census is late, then the legislative redistricting board doesn't get a license to operate. And that means that the legislature itself has to come back in a special session to draw the maps, and gives us the possibility, as I said, of writing a budget and doing some other things without redistricting in the way.
That's fascinating. I didn't realize the timing trigger there. That's really interesting. Let's see, we got a question from one of our viewers about the Black Lives Matter movement and what that does to sort of our politics and the projections for our upcoming elections. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think the immediate effect, this is what I was talking about with the police a little bit, but the immediate effect of it is it has energized a bunch of demonstrators, obviously, but potentially it has energized a new part of the electorate, a lot of voters. We had a larger than expected turnout in a July runoff. Runoff elections are usually low turnout affairs. July elections are just awful. It's 3 million degrees outside, and who wants to vote in that thing? And they're usually low interest elections, and turnout was really, given all of that, pretty robust this time, and an early signal that we've also seen in some other states that a lot of voters are activated who might not otherwise have been activated. I think some of that is attributable to the president, both pro and con. Like I said, he got his people excited. He also got his enemies excited. The George Floyd killing and the demonstrations that followed, have turned into, I think probably a movement and the kind of thing that elected officials have to address. It's going to be an issue in the election first and in the legislature second. A lot of people in politics are wondering how that changes the composition of the electorate. Does it get more Black and Hispanic voters out? In particular, does it get more young voters out? Mm-hmm. And are the voters who show up who wouldn't otherwise show up conservatives, liberals? What the heck are they? And also, back to that question about straight ticket voting, do they vote in the top race and then go home? So we'll see. I think in the legislative sense, this is where the conversation about policing and about funding for police and about all of those kinds of things is really going to be manifest. And I think that, I'm always hesitant to say this because there have been so many examples where we have an incident that looks like it's going to trigger a movement that doesn't trigger a movement. We see these all the time in gun control, for example. Well, maybe Sutherland Springs will inspire legislation. Well, maybe Santa Fe High School will inspire legislation. This one looks like a movement at this moment, and in particular through the election, and I think maybe also into the legislative session.
Got it. A couple of questions related to transparency. I think watching Texas navigate this crisis has been so interesting compared to some of our, sister state associations, because their legislature meets every year, and so they have laws that are being passed, their lawmakers are in town. And in Texas, we've got the governor and we're watching Congress, and that's about it right now, right? And so right. It makes it harder, I think, for members of the public and even groups like ours to have a really clear view of what's going on, what policies are being decided and why. So a couple examples of that, contact tracing and really just the COVID data in particular. We've had multiple instances where, it turns out there were coding errors or our contact tracing is just overwhelmed, so we don't really have any data coming from that. What are your thoughts, as someone in journalism and someone who, spends your time really trying to dig into these stories and find the truth? Why are we having such a hard time in Texas getting good, reliable data and kind of following what's happening in that space?
The baseline answer to that is that we're not doing the same thing and haven't done the same thing with rigorous testing that you had to do in, biology class in high school or college. We're testing a population for a disease without randomly testing the population. If you think about the way that our testing has started and has proceeded is, if you're sick, come take a test. Well, that doesn't test the population, that just tests the part of the population that self-selects as ill. And, you never get a really good read if you're doing it that way. You have to test a certain number of people. Think of it like polling. If you only polled people on politics who said, well, wait a minute, I'm interested in voicing my opinion about that, you'd only get the political nerds like you and me. And you wouldn't necessarily get, normal, in our newsroom, we call them normal humans, right? We wouldn't get humans out there. The problem with the testing has been that it wasn't widespread enough to tell where in Texas we were having outbreaks and not having outbreaks in the beginning, how the disease was spreading in intensity and geography and where and among what parts of the population. And we weren't getting a random sample of, even if you were just in one place, if you were just working in Midland County, and you still weren't getting a full look at, a proper sample of the Midland County community to figure out exactly what the coronavirus looked like in Midland County. We have 254 counties, and we've never gotten a really good handle on the number of people. You have a population of 100 people. How many get the disease? How many of them get it really seriously? How many of them die? How many of them get it without any symptoms? All of those sort of fundamental answers that would have guided policy through April, May, June, July, and now into August. And, this isn't just a Texas problem, but it is a Texas problem. And then you compound it with the contact tracing problem. You have a bunch of civil liberty issues with this. Am I going to let them follow all of my behavior just to figure out if I got sick on that airplane or in that movie theater, whatever it was? And we've never really gotten contact tracing off the ground in a truly meaningful way. We've had spots where we did, and we've had, moments where, well, we know these all started at this party or this event or that swimming pool or whatever. But in terms of a broad contact tracing and testing program that would really give us a map of the state and a map of the coronavirus in the state, we've never gotten a handle on that.
Yeah, that's certainly what we've seen. And it's tough because, as you said, the data is what you need to drive decision making. But if you don't have that data, right, then it sometimes feels like we're flying blind a little bit. And as I've said repeatedly, it's a lot easier to scare someone than it is to convince a scared person to not be scared, right? Yeah. And so especially in our industry, we've seen that where, earlier on, we didn't have a lot of data. And so people sort of made assumptions about where COVID was spreading and kind of ran with that. And so it's interesting to see how the data or lack thereof can really drive decision-making for good or ill, right?
Right. We're just getting a bad reading. I pulled up my phone here. This big red sign is in the middle of Collin County's COVID site. A lot of the counties have trackers up and say there have been this many cases. This is what's going on. And this big red sign in Collin County says, Collin County is providing COVID-19 numbers and data as a convenience to our residents. However, because we have been made aware of inaccuracies in the Department of State Health Services reporting, we must advise residents that Collin County has no confidence in the data currently being provided to us. It's hard to figure out exactly what your policy should be if you don't know exactly what the problem is that you're trying to solve.
Yeah, that's pretty amazing. Here's some data, but we have no confidence that it's accurate. That's pretty amazing.
Right.
One other kind of transparency related question that is something that I've been very interested in is, Texas got all this money from Congress under the CARES Act, a little over $6 billion to the state itself. Our cities and counties got another $5 billion. And of course, as of right now, that money has to be spent by the end of the year on some pretty specific COVID related items. And of course, our legislature doesn't come back into session until January when that time clock is stopped. And $6 billion, even in Texas, is a pretty good chunk of change. So any insight on kind of where that money's going, who's watching those dollars, who's involved in that decision making? I just think it's fascinating that we have such a large sum of money that has to be spent very quickly. And if you think about sort of prior disasters, right, when there's a lot of FEMA money coming in, it's always about a year later, right, where we're reading those stories about like, who got that money and what did they spend it on? So I'm just curious, looking ahead of it, what's going on there? What can you tell us about that?
A lot of it happens, as you know, in the governor's office and in the Legislative Budget Board, which is a panel of 5 from the Senate, 5 from the House. It's co-chaired by the Lieutenant Governor and the Speaker, and that panel has the legislative ability to move money around when the whole legislature is not here. Some of the things that they need to spend CARES money on haven't happened yet. They've got $200 million, for example, that is now on its way to being spent on laptops, tablets, and internet access for students who are now going back to school, but are going to have to operate virtually. So there's $200 million that they're going to spend there. There's some other money for schools, and there's some stuff that they've got kind of set aside to spend through the end of the year. But here they have a really big transparency problem. I can't go anywhere online and say, show me the ledger right now, and show me what you're looking at, what you've committed, what may not be committed by the state, but may be dedicated by the funding passed by Congress. Tell me what you're waiting for in the second round of CARES that we really need and that could affect the state budget. A lot of those questions are just sort of these nebulous, smoky questions out there that I think, a lot of legislators are getting pretty frustrated about. You've got some legislators suing the governor over his authority and in a lawsuit that includes his own state party chairman. And I think, a lot of those people just really want some answers and some look at what's going on with all this money. We had a ton of stimulus money, if you'll remember, after the global financial crisis in 2008. And actually, that happened in an election year, and we were going into a 2009 legislative session, and we were looking at a giant deficit. And in some ways, that shaped up kind of like where we are right now. And the federal government put a ton of stimulus money out into the states. And in fact, in Texas, it was enough money to get us through the 2009 session and the 2-year budget that they wrote without any new taxes and without significant cuts. But in 2011, there was a reckoning, and they came back. They were short of a bunch of money. They had to cut public education by $5.5, $6 billion, had to do a lot of stringent cutting, and it was, super unpleasant. And I think that's going to inform a lot of their thinking as we go now. And it's going to probably inform a lot of their demands for transparency about where the money is, where it's coming from, where it's going.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I know, when we ask questions about where that money is going, we hear a lot. Even Comptroller Hager this morning was talking about, the effort to get Congress to kind of loosen some of the restrictions on that money so that presumably they can use it to fill holes in the budget that aren't necessarily COVID related. And so that's a great point, though, that when you use one-time money to fill kind of structural holes, the bill still comes and often larger, especially after kind of the unprecedented amount of money that was invested in public education and property taxes last session. I remember the discussions even then that we didn't know how we were going to pay for those investments over the long term with a good economy and a good oil market. And so those questions seem to be even bigger at this point.
Right. You can play a game here with, if you this is speculative and it may not come to pass, but, cities and counties and school districts are setting property tax rates and their budgets right now. And those are based on property values as of January 1st. Back there when I was talking to your board in a whole different universe, almost a different state. It's not hard to imagine that property values will change when we redo what those properties are worth on January 1st of 2021. And the property taxes based on presumably lower property values might be lower. And so you're going to pass this financial difficulty all the way down the chain to local governments, to local school districts that are in part financed by the state government. We've got a long list of things to take care of in this financial chain that we haven't even seen yet.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Well, I'm going to leave it up with one final question here. So for those who aren't political nerds like me and you, what's our pitch for why they should care about Texas politics, why they should be involved? They're probably thinking, I'm trying to keep my business afloat. Why should they care? Why should they tune in?
I can make an argument this year that, we're not talking about conceptual problems or political party arguing points in the way that we have in some past elections. It's not just, the red team says this, the blue team says that, pick a side, like a football game or something. We're dealing with actually existential problems. The reason we have government is to deal with things like pandemics and recessions and, our civil rights and all of these kinds of things. This is the stuff that, even if you don't care about politics or government, really matters. The policies that they make, and the restaurant I don't need to tell anybody in the restaurant business, the policies that they make affects our livelihoods, our culture, our economics, everything. And if you don't play, you don't have a voice. If you don't, if this doesn't get you off the couch, you're just a non-participant.
Please get off the couch. That's the final word of the day. It does make a difference. So I know with DC, it often feels like you're just yelling into a black hole up there, but at least in Austin, and Ross, I don't know if this has been your experience, but certainly been mine. They have to listen. And the louder the voice is, the more traction you get in that pink dome. So.
Well, this is what happened on public education after 2018. There was a lot of noise, and a lot of people in the legislature, frankly, were like, yada, yada, yada. Let's wait and see if the voters really mean it or if this is just a talking point brought up by the other party. And sure enough, the voters showed up in 2018, and there was a very evident education vote there. And in the 2019 legislative session, there was a very evident response to that vote. So pretty clear example.
That's a great example. All right, well, thank you so much. Thank you, Ross, for joining us and sharing all of your insights. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me back. I really appreciate it.
All right, bye, everyone. Thank you for tuning in. And don't forget to tune in to the subsequent panels. We've still got a lot of great content coming up over the next couple of days. So thank you so much.